Thank you so much for coming and for being part of this event here. And these Anderson Lectures have featured some of the most distinguished Christian scholars in the sciences, speaking on the intersection of their faith and their academic work. For example, our past Anderson Lectures have included climate scientist Catherine Hayhoe, physicist Stephen Barr, geneticist Charmaine Royal and Dennis Alexander, and several others. So for our 8th V. Elving Anderson Lecture tonight, we're delighted to host Dr. Bill Newsome on the topic of two minds. A neuroscientist balances faith and science, or science and faith. And the whole topic of neuroscience is obviously an emerging field. Actually, it has been there for a long time already. But it has massive developments, seen massive developments in all kind of different things. There's a truly multidisciplinary field where lots and lots of different disciplines come together. And the implications of the findings of neuroscience could be potentially enormous. And so it's amazing that we can actually talk about it and speak about it, and also to bring those kind of ideas of neuroscience into context of the Christian faith. And we're so thankful that Dr. Bill Newsome is able to help us to understand that a little bit better and process that a little better and help us to understand it from his own experience, how he actually stands in that as both a Christian and a scientist. Before I turn things over to Dr. Natalie Covington, who's going to introduce Dr. Newsome, I'll mention a couple of quick things. First, if you haven't already received Anselm House emails, we invite you to use the QR code on the screen, and I'm going to see where I can pull that up here. Right here, and I'm going to pause that before it disappears. There we go. To use the... Oh, well, apparently I cannot do that. Here's the QR code again. To be quick. We can see whether we can pause this maybe later. So use the QR code on the screen, or stop at a table in the hallway, maybe that's better, to sign up for our email list. That's the best way to keep up with all that's going on within our community. Second, after tonight's lecture, you're invited to continue the conversation and to join us for some really good food and a celebratory sneak peek into our new place right across the street. So after the lecture, we are not going to have a post-lecture reception here, but we'll have the post-lecture reception in Melrose Station, our new home, and we invite you all to come over there, either just to hang around there or to continue the conversation. And I'll have more details at the very end of the lecture. I'll now welcome Dr. Natalie Covington, Assistant Professor in the Speech Language Hearing Sciences here at the university. Dr. Covington has a PhD from Vanderbilt and specializes in speech language pathology, a field closely related to neuroscience. She actually has a grant related to brain injury, focusing on cognitive rehabilitation, and has several publications in the area of cognitive neuroscience. Natalie, thank you so much for your willingness to introduce and welcome Dr. Bill Newsome.
Thanks so much, AJ. Oh, can you hear me? Is that coming through? Wonderful. All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Again, my name's Natalie Covington, and I'm a faculty member in the Speech Language Hearing Sciences Department here at the U. And tonight I have the distinct honor of introducing Dr. William Newsome. My own background is as a speech-language pathologist with a clinical focus on recovery and rehabilitation after brain injury. And my work here as a researcher at the U falls broadly within the interdisciplinary field of cognitive neuroscience. And so my work is grounded in and is deeply indebted to groundbreaking discoveries about the physiology of the brain and its links to behavior that have been advanced by systems neuroscientists like Dr. Newsome. Dr. Newsome is the Harmon Family Provostial Professor of Neurobiology at the Stanford University School of Medicine and the director of the Wutsai Neurosciences Institute. He is a leading investigator in systems and cognitive neuroscience and has made fundamental contributions to our understanding of the neural mechanisms underlying visual perception and decision-making. Among his many honors are the Rank Prize in Optoelectronics, the Spencer Award, the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award of the American Psychological Association, the Dan David Prize of Tel Aviv University, and the Carl Spencer Lashley Award of the American Philosophical Society. His distinguished lectureships include the 13th Annual Marr Lecture at the University of Cambridge, the 9th Annual Brenda Milner Lecture at McGill University, and most recently, the Distinguished Visiting Scholar Lectures at the Kavli Institute of Brain and Mind at UC San Diego. Dr. Newsome was elected to membership in the National Academy of Sciences in 2000 and to the American Philosophical Society in 2011. He has co-chaired the NIH Brain Working Group, which was charged with forming a national plan for the coming decade of neuroscience research in the United States. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bill Newsome to give this year's Anderson Lecture.
So it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I do have a microphone here. Can you hear me in the back? Am I coming across okay? All right, thank you. Pleasure for me to be here. I actually had planned to be here to give this lecture in 2020. I had a plane ticket purchased. I was coming in April of 2020, and I got a call from the university saying that the university was shutting down in March of 2020, and we would have to postpone this thing. And so here we are a year and a half later, and finally I've made it. It's an honor for me to give this talk to honor the legacy of Elving Anderson here at the University of Minnesota, which I understand has been substantial, and to talk to you tonight about the topic of two minds, a neuroscientist balances science and faith. As AJ said, about 60 or 70 faculty gathered last night to talk about issues of brain, mind, and free will, which we'll revisit some tonight. And I learned from my colleague David Reddish here at the University of Minnesota that I need to have at least three minds, because there are three decision-making processes in the brain that he distinguishes as important. And who knows, maybe there are 4 or 5 that need to be added as well, but at least three I might need to. But I think David would argue that those are all the same mind, part of the same mind. I comment this from the point of view of, being a Christian, a practicing Christian who is also an academic at a high-level university, like many people in this room are, and experiencing occasionally tension or difficulty, a lot of times very interesting conversations because of those dual commitments to science and scientific truth and to my religious faith as well. And I've come to see that these are really important conversations to have, and they're ones that I want to talk with you about tonight. And there are places where these two minds or two ways of viewing or investigating or knowing the world, I think are in very nice alignment with each other, and there are places where I think there are genuine tensions. So the way that I sort of parse these out is that for me there's no need for any fundamental tension between religion and the discoveries of science, the findings of science. But tension can occur and does occur between religion and the working assumptions of everyday science, especially when these assumptions are elevated to the status of an all-encompassing ideology. And I'll try to parse those two things for you here in the next few minutes, the first few minutes of the talk. In terms of the findings of science, where science really has made pivotal discoveries that impinge or impact religious faith and our understanding of our religious faith, I think there are two really big ones. One is about origins of our universe, and second one is about origins of life on our planet, right? And so we're going to talk about those really briefly. They're just really comments more than discussions before getting to the places where I think there are genuine tension. On the way tonight, we're going to be talking about some neuroscience. I'm going to throw some real neuroscience at you, so buckle your seatbelts. I'll give you warning when that comes. And we're going to be talking about the nature of causality and how we reason about causes. And we'll get around to this topic of free will, which was a matter of intense discussion at the faculty roundtable last night. So in terms of findings about origins of the universe, The prevailing scientific theory now for which there's outstanding evidence is the Big Bang, that our universe, it does not go back infinitely in time. There was a moment of actual creation, and before that moment, there was no space nor time, neither space nor time. And in my opinion, I could hardly imagine a scientific result whose fundamental point is more consistent with the fundamental point of creation stories in Genesis, right? That the universe did have a beginning, that there was a moment of creation. I mean, it's like, 13.6 billion years ago or whatever it was. Robert Jastrow was he's a former head of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies at NASA, and he wrote this book, little book. It's a short read. I recommend it. It's called God and the Astronomers. And to my knowledge, he's not a religious believer, but there's this one passage out of this book where he's talking about, the epochal discoveries of the Big Bang and the origins of the universe. And this one passage I'll read for you. He says, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. And as he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries." So this is kind of one perspective on this. And I think it's a generally shared notion that, the Big Bang was this moment of creation, a wondrous moment of creation, and trying to wrap our heads around that, even as scientists, even though we can plot, or, and when I say we, I'm using the royal we, 10 milliseconds by 10 milliseconds events in those first moments of the existence of our universe. What happened before that is unknown. In fact, what happened before that is probably a nonsense statement because time itself came into being then. So this is something, I don't think there's any conflict here. I mean, the second area of perceived conflict is the theory of evolution, the origins of the species, life as we see it here on Earth. But once again, for me, it is no issue for God to have created however God wished to, whether it was by evolution, whether it was ex nihilo, whether it was something more resembling the creation stories in Genesis. I simply don't find an issue with this. And I think that the evidence for evolution by natural selection is excellent. It's something that is the core theory that binds almost all of biology together. And, there's been a number of books written about this, most notably Francis Collins, head of the National Institutes of Health, who's argued eloquently for the compatibility of evolutionary theories and religious faith. But curiously, I'm going to cite a passage from this book, The Blind Watchmaker by Richard Dawkins. And most of you know that Dawkins is a professor at Oxford University and is one of the militant atheists. I would call them evangelical atheists. And this book is actually an excellent read about the mechanisms of evolution and the power of evolution to present increasing complexity. But I was really startled to read this quote, and the blue text is my emphasis, not his. But he's arguing for how natural and easy it would be for intelligent life to emerge on Earth by purely natural means. He says, "My personal feeling is that once cumulative selection has got itself properly started, we need to postulate only a relatively small amount of luck in the subsequent evolution of life and intelligence." And here's my emphasized part. Cumulative selection, once it has begun, seems to me powerful enough to make the evolution of intelligence probable, if not inevitable. And I would say inevitable is a really strong word in this context. It sounds a lot like creation. It sounds a lot like a humanizing universe where humans, not just humans, but other species, if you really believe in this inevitable thing, this is very close to a religious experience here, in my opinion, with this quote. So that's all I'm really going to say about findings. I really just wanted to get this out of the way so that you know where I'm coming from. But let's go on now and talk about places where I find real tension, and these are really assumptions. So in general parlance, sorry?
I think there's a problem with your mic.
A problem with the mic? We're okay? We're okay. I can talk louder if I need to. So in common understanding, science is experiment-based, it's precise, it's objective in the sense that it's transferable across communities and cultures. If I do science right in my laboratory, my students and I, the results that we get can be replicated anywhere in the world by people with the right equipment and right conceptual background. Whereas religion is more holistic, it's greater dependence on intuition, and it requires commitment, personal commitment, in the absence of anything approaching scientific proof. And I've been asked by many people, including people in my lab, a postdoc, over one conversation I remember with a postdoc, he said, why go there? Why do that religious thing? Why not just stick with science? And I find that kind of question comes from lots of scientists and lots of academics. And basically, my general form of my reply to this is that when you say, why not just stick with science, this requires an extra scientific assumption or an extra scientific commitment, a faith commitment, if you want to, that science is the only path to reliable knowledge, or maybe the very best path to reliable knowledge about the world. And that assumption is not a part of science itself. That is a philosophical assumption that people make for their own purposes, which is fine, because I make plenty of philosophical assumptions for my purposes, so it's just fine. But I want people to understand that that's extra scientific. That is not science itself. And I would say that the religious mode of thought and belief is actually a normal and necessary mode of evaluation and decision making in real life for all of us. And to elaborate that, I would say that the scientific mode of investigation and learning and belief, in contrast, is quite peculiar. It's applicable to a rather narrow range of experience and is generally practiced by a rather small community of professionals. That's a lot of people in this room, but it's a small community by world standards. And why I say that the scope is rather narrow is that I think the most important questions in life, in all of our lives, are not susceptible to solution by the scientific method. So, what's an example of an important question that's not susceptible to solution? Well, this is one, okay? Is it better to live or to die? And that elicits chuckles, but it's deadly serious for a lot of people. And there's no set of experiments you can go into a laboratory and do and approach a question like this from a scientific point of view and try to answer this for a particular person. Here's another one that's important. Should I marry this person, right? And if you wait around for scientific proof, you're going to be waiting a long time, is all I can say. And there are so many of these. Should I take a job that uproots my family, moves it across the country, interrupts a network of relationships and social capital that you've built over years in a place? This is the stuff of life, right? And it's not susceptible to science. And one of the problems is we can't do control experiments, right? We can't run the tape back and do it over again and see how it comes out under several different ways you play it out, which we do in the science lab all the time. But that's not the way life has to be lived. And I would say that a religious quest, broadly considered a quest for meaning and understanding about the universe, it involves the same sort of reasoning as a marriage example. Now, this does not mean that we check our brains at the door. This is a caricature of religious faith, and sometimes people do go into religious faith checking their brains at the door, but it doesn't mean we have to. And there are sources of evidence that we rely on, both in deciding to marry and in deciding whether to make a religious commitment or not. There's your experience in the relationship. There are wise people that you've come to rely on for mentorship or guidance. There are all kinds of reasoning and pieces of evidence you bring to bear. So you're thinking as you're going, hopefully. But in the end, the scientific evidence is not compelling in a scientific sense. And a certain amount of faith accompanied by commitment is essential. And I think the stakes are high, quite frankly. So I think put simply, this is the human condition. It's life, and our most consequential decisions in life have little or nothing to do with science. You know, the universal gravitational constant is really, really important, but probably a decision to marry or not marry is for most of us, is more important than that. And I think this is true for all of us, including scientists, although scientists sometimes don't really inquire deeply enough to really acknowledge this fully. And I think that for all of us, the real question is there an ultimate source of meaning and value in the universe? And if so, what is it? And that is the really core question that leads to a religious quest and the possibility of religious commitment in response to this kind of universal question. And I'm going to throw one quote from the Bible. I promise you it's only one. It's the only one I'm going to do tonight. But it really struck me. This comes from the Gospel of John in the 6th chapter. And this is after Jesus had engaged in some very difficult teaching that the disciples were having a hard time swallowing, literally, if any of you know this passage here. The gospel says, after this, many of his disciples drew back and no longer went about with him. So some of the disciples just jumped ship, right? And Jesus said to the 12, do you also wish to go away? These are the core 12 disciples. And Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom would we go? You have the words of eternal life. And Peter follows on in the next verse, and he says, this is a very interesting piece of epistemology here in light of what I've just said for the last 10 minutes. And we have believed, so this is Peter talking to Jesus, and we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God. Now, the order there is really interesting, right? It's we have believed and come to know. It's not we have known and have come to believe, but we have believed. There's this act of commitment, an act of faith, and then coming to know in some deeper sense. So that's exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about, you know, with faith and commitment and some trust and hope being involved in our most major decisions in life. And it's interesting to see that epistemology reflected here. So that's the only Bible verse I'm gonna throw at you. So just to summarize this piece of the talk, I don't see any deep conflict between my religious faith and the actual discoveries or findings of science, but tension can occur between religion and the working assumptions of everyday science, especially if they're elevated to ideology or exclusivity. So I'm a neuroscientist, and I'm sure a lot of you are expecting to hear some things about the brain tonight. And so what about the brain? So I'll start in on the brain piece of this with what I would call the central dogma of neuroscience. And this is a play on words, actually. It comes from Watson and Crick's, or Francis Crick's, the central dogma of molecular biology, which is DNA gives rise to RNA, gives rise to proteins, and proteins do the business of the cell. But this is what I would call the central dogma of neuroscience, that most neuroscientists, this is just our working assumption. When we go to work every day, this is our working assumption, that all of our behavior and all of our mental life, including our sense of a conscious, continuing self, is inextricably linked to the biology of the brain. Or as our moderator at the faculty roundtable last night said, is rooted in the biology of the brain. Now those are both carefully chosen words. Inextricably linked or rooted in avoids deterministic language like determined by. But at the bottom of a lot of our questions about neuroscience, and the more we learn about the brain as another organ, another tissue that we can understand, even though it's vastly more complicated, but in principle we can understand the same way we understand the heart or the lung or the kidneys, is this feeling that if there are biological mechanisms that our mental lives and even spiritual lives are rooted in, there's this kind of fear that there's these deterministic mechanisms going on deep in our brains that we have no awareness of and no control over, and it raises the issue of how much freedom do we actually have to choose. And one comment I would make right here at the outset is that this is not a new problem, right? It's not a new question. Those of you who are up on your Pauline theology know that even Paul marveled at the very bad that I don't want to do, I can't help but do, and the good that I want to do, I cannot do, right? So even Paul wrestled with this, and many people in the church. And I just want to take one interlude here, and I'm going to show you a video about a technique that has revolutionized neuroscience over the last 15 years called optogenetics. Many neuroscience professors and graduate students and postdocs here at the University of Minnesota use this technique in their labs right now. Optogenetics is a way of reaching into the brain, basically, and controlling the activity of neurons or nerve cells, in particular well-defined circuits within the brain, and that can be genetically targeted. And the way you do this is through genetic tricks that make those cells that you're targeting sensitive to light. And if you shine light on those cells, you can actually stimulate that circuit and no other circuit into overactivity, or you can inhibit that circuit, so shut it down, and you can look at the effects on behavior. The blue light excites the circuits, the yellow light will inhibit them, and this has become a very powerful manipulative tool that we can use to really test theories about the functional roles of specific circuits in the brain. And I'm going to show you a little video of optogenetics in action. And in this experiment, this is came from David Anderson's lab at Caltech, published in 2015, a few years ago. It's a particularly powerful example. And what you're going to see is a mouse in its home cage. There's a male mouse. You'll see the fiber optic coming down. It's attached to the head. The mouse doesn't pay any attention to it. There's a little tiny hole in the skull underneath the fiber optic, and the fiber optic goes down to a structure called the amygdala, the central amygdala. Those of you who have some neurobiological knowledge know that this is part of the limbic system that is involved in the control of emotion and behaviors that express emotion. And you'll see the mouse is just kind of running around its cage, and then there's a partner mouse who's been introduced, and the mouse for whom this is its home cage is a male. The introduced mouse is a female, and surprise, surprise, the male is very interested in the female and runs over and tries to be friendly and sniffing and stuff like that. And then you're going to see two words come on that says laser on, which is when the blue light starts shining and hitting this few thousand cells in the central amygdala, and you'll see a startling change in the animal's behavior, and that'll last for several seconds, and then the blue light will go off. So here you go. This is optogenetics in action. So this is channel rhodopsin stimulation of medial amygdala neurons. So there's the male, very interested in this female, sniffing at her in inviting ways. Now laser on, so the blue light starts shining, and this animal goes into attack mode, basically. This is the way he would react to a male intruder on his home turf, not a female intruder. And then you'll see the laser go off, and he just resumes his normal inquiring relationship with female. Now, this is, I was talking actually with a geneticist here before the talk about the early days of genetics and genetic modification and accusations of playing God by manipulating genomes. This can be cast in the same frame, right? And this worries a lot of people who see this kind of thing. It's to start imagining, hyper-aggressive soldiers or something with fiber optics in their brains. That's not happening, but this is extremely powerful, and these kinds of experiments make us realize how deeply rooted this central dogma of neuroscience is, right? That behavior, social relations, as complex as recognizing the other sex and reacting appropriately, it's under control and under influence of these neural circuits deep in the brain. So, the question that arises is what do you think about free will in circumstances like this? And a kind of a flip answer that I read online at some point, this is actually some comedian named Phillips. I don't remember his name, but he said, "I am not a fatalist, but even if I were, what could I do about it?" So, there are a lot of, I would say that there are kind of three major responses to this, and again, people for whom this is their real business, philosophers of mind and some neuroscientists who think about this more deeply than I do would undoubtedly come up with more. But one of them is just to say, everything's determined by these neurons and chemicals that are acting in the brain, and our sense of an ability to make meaningful choice, to have some free dimension of our choice, is an illusory choice, and we should chuck this whole concept altogether. I am not in favor of this. I don't believe, actually, that we live in a deterministic world. At a deep level, of course, at a micro level, the laws of physics that are relevant are quantum mechanics, which involves probabilistic predictions of the future. Most physicists that I've consulted don't think that quantum mechanics plays much of a role in the brain, although there are some very, very good neuroscientists who believe that there's a chance that quantum mechanics does play a role in the brain. Most of the physicists I've talked to say that there is noise in the brain, but it's thermal, it's not quantum mechanical noise. So, but we do live in an indeterministic world because there are these quantum mechanisms that affect our macroscopic, more Newtonian world. And the example that I think is most compelling is that absorption of rays from the sun, high energy photons from the sun, can cause cancer, can cause melanoma, and cause a death in your family or my family that's a radical invasion of our macroscopic world, right? And profound implications for the future of all of us in this room. And the absorption of photons by matter is the quintessential quantum mechanical event, the quintessential probabilistic event. And here's a situation where quantum mechanics does invade our macro worlds. So I don't think we live in a deterministic world in the end. And I've already indicated that I don't really think that quantum mechanics offers us a way, out of the determinism issue. And here's a third way that many people embrace, and I think this is the average. This is you just take the average person on the street, and you take me some of the time, and our definition of freedom, when we think of freedom, it means that our actions or behavior are uncaused. Okay, so if there's some cause for our behavior or our choice of what to eat for dinner or whatever, then we're not free, and I reject this. Okay, if we accept that definition, if that's the definition of freedom, then I don't believe in freedom or free will. I think things happen for causes. My behavior is produced by complex histories that I have, my memories of those histories, the values that I've developed from my history, the aspirations that I have. These personal kinds of things are great causes of my behavior, and furthermore, I like causal mechanisms. When I walk out on the street tonight, I don't want to miss the 100th car that comes along because of some indeterministic process in my brain, right? I want a reliable mechanism in there that's going to catch the cars, as close to 100% of the time as can be. So I hesitate. Well, I try to fight against this notion, but it's hard to fight against it, that if something has a cause, then it's not free. Here's what I actually think I aim for, which is something that I refer to as self-determination. So I'm not trying to get away from determination or determinism, but I want to talk meaningfully about self-determination, or what I would call autonomy. And here's the way that I define this. This is as simple a definition as I can get, and we discussed a lot of this last night. But this definition here is: my behavior is caused, at least in part, not all. There are things that influence my behavior, like my genes, that I had nothing to do with and I cannot control. There are things that influence my behavior, like the culture that I was raised in, that have very powerful determinations on my attitudes and behavior. There's many things that I can't control, but my behavior is caused, at least in part, by my beliefs and my values and my memories, my goals and my aspirations. So there's wiggle room for these things to be, to influence actually my behavior and my choices. And here's a coda that I would address, and I won't have any, this is the only time tonight I'll mention the C word, consciousness. And I would actually postulate that conscious, rational thought plays a causal role in my behavior. I think consciousness is causal. I don't think it's just like the foam on top of a wave that's along for the ride. But if anyone wants to ask me about that during the Q&A period, I can have more to say about that. I think the key issue here is what counts as a cause, okay? If you're a causal fundamentalist and you think that the 4 fundamental forces in physics are the only things that do work in the world and the only things, therefore, that are causal, then you're down to reducing everything, all of behavior, all the events in this room, to the Schrödinger wave equation, writing a wave equation that'll predict the motions of all the atoms in this room for the next 20 minutes. It's a probabilistic prediction, but that's what you're reduced to. You commit yourself to that reductive path, philosophical reductive path. But I don't think that we should attribute causality only to the 4 fundamental forces in physics. And I think, especially as a neuroscientist, and I think this goes for all of biology and actually most complex systems in the world, that neuroscience explanations, including attribution of causality, is intrinsically multi-level, okay? Now, this is really important, and I'm going to take you now on a digression through some neuroscience. This is the part I warned you about. And try to hang with me. It's not that complicated, and I'll try to make it as easily understandable as possible. So let me give you an illustration of something that neuroscientists are interested in. Natalie alluded to systems neuroscience and the kind of problems that we work on and influencing her work in speech pathology and understanding cognitive neuroscience. Well, here's another problem that lots of neuroscientists work on, including some very good ones here at the University of Minnesota, and it's the mystery of long-term spatial memory. So long-term spatial memory is what you use when you're trying to find your car in a parking lot like this, okay? And some of us are really good at this, and some of us are pretty bad at this, right? There's a lot of human variation here in our ability to do spatial memory tasks, but psychologists and neuroscientists want to know how this works, because finding one car in the midst of that is a rather daunting challenge, and there are actually different strategies. Different people have different strategies for doing this. So the first thing that a psychologist or neuroscientist will do if they want to investigate spatial memory, so that's the target, that's the explanandum, as the philosophers of science like to say. And the first thing that the neuroscientist will do is to operationalize this. Okay, let's get an example of long-term spatial memory that we can work with in the laboratory. And frequently it's a mouse navigating some sort of maze, okay? And the animal has to learn its way through the maze, and the better it learns, the better it knows that maze, the more reliably it can get the reward that lies at the end of the labyrinth that it has to navigate. So here's a behavior that's easy to measure. You can measure how long it takes the animal to find the reward. You can see how that finding time shortens as the animal gets better and better. You can see what the cost is when you introduce it into a new maze. You can do all sorts of things to characterize this phenomenon at a behavioral level. But ultimately, the neuroscientist wants to get in the brain and find out, what's going on. So one of the epochal discoveries in the neuroscience is that there's a structure down near the middle of the brain called the hippocampus, and it's really quite beautiful, as you can see in that cell body stained section through the brain up there. The little letters CA1, CA2, and CA3 are different subdivisions of the hippocampus, and the hippocampus actually contains a map of space. It's referred to now, you'll see it in the popular literature, as the brain's GPS system. That's an oversimplification. It's clickbait, for the internet, but it's not a crazy way to characterize it. And a Nobel Prize was awarded about, 5 to 10 years ago for really key discoveries in the nature of the hippocampal spatial map. But neuroscientists aren't satisfied just to say, aha, the hippocampus is an important player here. If we inactivate the hippocampus with optogenetics or some other technique, this navigation, the memories go to pot for spatial memory in particular. The cellular neuroscientist wants to know what it is about the hippocampus that helps create these spatial maps, because you lift that same mouse up and you put it in a different maze, and a new map develops as the animal learns its way around that new environment. And there's a phenomenon at the synapses, the little connections between nerve cells where they signal to each other, called synapses. There's a phenomenon called long-term potentiation. There's also a phenomenon called long-term depression that actually changes the strengths of synaptic connections between nerve cells. And when you learn something, you are strengthening a lot of synapses in your brain, and you're weakening other synapses in your brain. And this is a really interesting phenomena, because underneath long-term potentiation, it's not enough just to show that long potentiation is there. Yet another wave of scientists comes along and says, well, how does that work? how does LTP actually work? This is descriptive, you know, these little papers that you're publishing. And they've discovered that there's a particular protein molecule that plays a really critical role in this modification of synaptic strength, and it's called the NMDA receptor. And NMDA receptors have to be activated in order for these, what we call plastic changes, to occur in synaptic strengths, right? But there's yet another group of scientists that comes along and says, well, how did those NMDA receptors get there in the first place? And what governs their concentration at particular synapses? And of course, you know, it's with anything in biology, some of the action ultimately lies at the genetic level. And genes control the expression of these protein molecules and how they get to their positions in the synapses. So here, if we go to spatial memory and taking that as our explanandum, we've got, you know, we've reduced that to, we've operationalized that. We haven't reduced it. We've operationalized that as a mouse navigating a maze. It can be a land maze or a water maze. We have water mazes as well. But here's beneath the simple behavioral observations, here's 4 levels of explanation. Here's a hippocampus in the spatial map. There's LTP that underlies the formation of spatial maps in the hippocampus. There's this beautiful molecule called an NMDA receptor, and ultimately there's genetic regulation of it. And this is characteristic of explanations in neuroscience and explanations in biology. And this is what I meant on one of those previous slides when I said explanation is intrinsically multi-level, okay? And I have deliberately drawn here arrows going between these in both directions. I've drawn arrows going up from genes to NMDA receptors to LTP, but I've also drawn arrows coming down from the hippocampus down to the level of genes and gene regulation. And I do that advisedly. And here's really the key point of this exercise. You're wondering, why in the world is he telling me this stuff? And here's kind of the key point. And it's made by a philosopher of science named Carl Craver, who published this book about, I don't know, 10 years, no, it was 2008, I think. It's called Explaining the Brain, Mechanisms and the Mosaic Unity of Neuroscience. Craver has a master's degree in experimental neuroscience. He's done his time in the lab. He knows experimental neuroscience well, and he gets the science well. But what he talks about are these multi-level mechanistic explanations in neuroscience, and he identifies a feature of these complex systems which he calls mutual manipulability, okay? So that sounds complicated, it's a mouthful, but it simply means that when you have a multi-level system like this that's responsible for some high-level behavior, that the way you know you have the mechanism, the way neuroscientists identify mechanism, is that you can intervene at any one level and you can influence the other levels, okay? That's what it means, mutual manipulability. And here's a quote. He says, mutual manipulability, and he says, this means that a part is a component in a mechanism. And that's what we're after in biology. We're after mechanisms, okay? And a part is a component in a mechanism if one can change the behavior of the mechanism as a whole by intervening to change the component, and that and is critical, one can change the behavior of the component by intervening to change the behavior of the mechanism as a whole. And he calls this simply making a difference. Now, I find this incredibly congenial as a scientist because this is what I do in the lab. I try to manipulate a system at some level and see if it makes any difference at other levels. And if it does, those things are linked together in some meaningful ways that comprise an explanation. So in this example here, for example, we can manipulate the hippocampus as a whole by turning that thing off, and we have ripple effects all the way down the line. LTP is no longer happening if the hippocampus as a whole is turned off. NMDA receptors are not being activated. The genetic expression of these molecules is all whacked out. Or we can leave the hippocampus as a whole alone, and we actually have ways to do molecular manipulations that will selectively delete LTP, inactivate LTP. And if LTP is a part of this mechanism, when you inactivate LTP, you should have effects on the mouse's behavior, on its navigation of the maze. You should also have effects on NMDA receptor activation in the genes. And similarly, if we manipulate the NMDA receptor, and I visited a lab at the U this morning that is actually involved in manipulating the NMDA receptor in prefrontal cortex as an investigation of neural mechanisms underlying potentially schizophrenia. So this isn't science fiction. This is something that neuroscientists do every day in the lab. But if you inactivate the NMDA receptor, and if that's a key part of this mechanism that underlies spatial memory, again, you should have effects all up and down this line. If you make a change in some piece of this and it doesn't influence the others, then you suspect that your model is wrong. You've got the wrong biology and you need to go back to the lab and do more careful studies, okay? Now, this is important because you can think of these as knobs. Okay, where can I turn a knob and change the ultimate output, which is the spatial memory and the mouse solving the phase? And where can I make a difference? That's what Craver calls it, making a difference. And my argument, the core piece of my argument, is that if you can make a difference by turning knobs at particular levels, they are part of the causal story that underlies the behavior, okay? Now, that is really important because it cashes out in our understanding of freedom, in my opinion, or self-determination. I didn't intend that as a joke, but apparently. Okay, so what does it mean? Now, let's go back. So remember, I said, for me, the sense of the word freedom that's actually meaningful is self-determination. It's that my behavior is determined, at least in part, by things like values and aspirations and goals and my memories and my history, right? And those are the things that I really want to be able to attribute parts of my behavior to. Now, acknowledging that parts of my behavior are under genetic control and are out of my control. And what this amounts to is finding a way to talk meaningfully about non-fundamental causation. So, right? Remember, if you want to be the causal fundamentalist and you want to go right back to the 4 fundamental forces in physics, then ultimately you're going to throw the hippocampus overboard. You're going to throw LTP overboard. You're going to throw NMDA receptors overboard, and you're just going to write one big Schrodinger equation for the motion of all the atoms, right? But if we can find a way to talk meaningful about non-fundamental causation, so distributed causation throughout a mechanism, and I think we must, then we can take mental causation seriously. Not to say that it's separated from the biology. You can see it's still deeply, inextricably linked, I would say, to the biology, or it was said last night, deeply rooted in the biology. But if we can find a way to talk about causation, like explanation, being distributed among those levels, now we can take mental causation seriously. Now, I want you to hear me in one important thing. I am not saying that bottom-up causes are unimportant, okay? Explanatory relevance in something like I've shown you here with the spatial memory example runs both upwards and downwards through the various levels of the mechanism. All right, so it's gotten pretty abstract here. I understand that, so I'll try to pull it back to earth with a couple of simple examples. So the first example is a pair of contrasting quotes from a pair of books. This is from Richard Dawkins' 1976 book, The Selfish Gene. And Dawkins is, a genetic fundamentalist here. He says, this is a quote, "Genes swarm in huge colonies, safe inside gigantic lumbering robots." That's you and me, by the way. "Sealed off from the outside world, communicating with it by tortuous, indirect routes, manipulating it by remote control. They are in you and me. They created us, body and mind, and their preservation is the ultimate rationale for our existence." Okay? So this is very much a bottom-up view of causality here. The genes are where the action is. The genes are where the fundamental causes are. And these huge tortuous robots up there, we're simply there to preserve the existence of the genes. Now, Dawkins has a colleague at Oxford, Dennis Noble, who's a cellular physiologist and biophysicist. And Noble wrote a book about 30 years after The Selfish Gene called The Music of Life. And Noble, in an obvious kind of, it's not a parody really, it's a paraphrase from Dawkins. Noble looks at the same data as Dawkins and says something completely different about it. He says, "Genes are trapped in huge colonies, locked inside highly intelligent beings, molded by the outside world, communicating with it by complex processes through which blindly, as if by magic, function emerges. They are in you and me. We are the system that allows their code to be read, and their preservation is totally dependent on the joy that we experience in reproducing ourselves. We are the ultimate rationale for their existence." Okay? So, you know, this is a top-down. This is a very much attributing top-down causality to, you know, the facts as Dawkins and Noble look at them. They're the same facts, but they're bottom-up and they're top-down. And my argument here is that both, there are elements of truth to both. We don't have to choose between these. Now, this cashes out in clinical treatment. So I know we have some psychiatrists, psychologists in the room, and I was startled to read about this Lasker Award that occurred in 2006. The Lasker Awards are like American Nobel Prizes for really major discoveries in biomedical research. And in 2006, this gentleman with a bow tie here won one of these Lasker Awards. And he's a psychiatrist. He was at the University of Pennsylvania. His name is Aaron Beck. How many of you have ever heard of Aaron Beck? So we have maybe 10 people in the room. Aaron Beck invented cognitive behavioral therapy. And I'm sure that many more of you have experience with cognitive behavioral therapy. And cognitive behavioral therapy is a system of talk therapy and group talk therapy that the insurance companies, who have a lot of data on us, acknowledge as an effective and succinct treatment for really acute depression, okay? And the validation of cognitive behavioral therapy takes the form of publications like this one. This has been replicated many times across the years, both in adults and in adolescents. And basically, this is a comparison of treating people who pass certain criteria for really acute, severe depression. And it's a comparison of the effectiveness of antidepressant drugs, the serotonin reuptake inhibitor drugs, then another group that gets cognitive behavioral therapy instead of the drugs, and then another group that gets both. And the finding, the robust finding here, is that the group that gets both does better, and they're evaluated by psychiatrists who are blind to the group that any patient is in, right? So it's a carefully done study. And the finding is that the group that gets both the drugs and the talk therapy do better than the groups that get either alone, okay? Now, that, I think, tells us really something really important about the nature of the human animal. And it tells us, you know, in a very graphic form, in a very practical form, that we are both bottom-up and top-down animals. So the serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the drugs, are a classic bottom-up manipulation. The person who prescribes that drug doesn't really care that much. It's not their business to make you happy in your job, in your relationships, in your childhood, or whatever. They just care about the serotonin levels in your synapses. And the belief is that if you, well, the demonstration is that if you get those serotonin levels right, you can help patients, okay? But, so that's a classic bottom-up intervention. You know, it's not about, I mean, the behavioral measure is there at the end, but the intervention, the knob that the psychiatrist is turning, is at the molecular level. On the other hand, cognitive behavioral therapy is a top-down manipulation. You're trying to intervene in the patient's belief system. Beck himself called this cognitive restructuring, okay? And you're trying to get people to interact with the world and come to beliefs about the world that are different from the ones that are leading to the depressed behavior. And the message here from these studies is both of these things are effective. So I would say, you know, if you just try one or the other, you know, you'll give some help to some patients, but if you ignore one of those levels or the other, then you're doing your patients a disservice. And we do our philosophy a disservice, and we do our neuroscience a disservice if we try to ignore or emphasize one of those or the other. So, you know, Beck believed in changing people's beliefs, and I think a major conclusion here is that beliefs matter. And I think that, you know, this notion of high level in the mechanism, intervention, and causality gives us reason to think that beliefs matter, and beliefs and values and aspirations are part of the causal story. So remember that the key question here is autonomy. It's not really determinism versus non-determinism. It's what counts as a cause. And do my beliefs and aspirations and goals count as a cause? And if they do, that's what I think freedom is all about. So in summary, I will say, I think that understanding the nature of human freedom, I I put this slide down 10 years ago, and I said, is the most consequential problem facing the neurobehavioral sciences. It's important for obvious reasons of human dignity and social responsibility, but also for science itself. The key predicate of science is that we have the ability to reason rationally about the world, draw conclusions based on evidence, and change our conclusions if the evidence warrants it. I wrote this 10 years ago saying that it's the most consequential problem. Now, I just had my 70th birthday, and I've come to see actually that Alzheimer's disease is the most consequential problem facing the neurobehavioral sciences. But the nature of freedom runs at least right up there with it, and at least a close second. But it's important for science itself. And I would say that, I have this quote from John Haldane, famous geneticist from the middle of the 20th century, who poses this conundrum, this reaction. He says, if my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of the atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true, and hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. Which is another way of stating this thing that faith in science or trust in science as a way of knowing requires a certain amount of autonomy and self-determination and causal reasoning that goes above the genetic or molecular or quantum mechanical level. So I wanted to close by saying, just returning to the theme that I started out with about science and faith. And I've spent a lot of time on this bit of science because it's one that many, many people ask me about. I've done a lot of work on decision making. In fact, I gave a talk to the neuroscience community today here on aspects of decision making that we've worked on in the lab in the last several years. And I would say that this matters in the way that neuroscientists talk about their work and the implications of their work to the public. Many neuroscientists are what I would call scientific imperialists or triumphalists, who think that neuroscience will conquer all in the end, and when we get to the end of the story, neuroscientifically, we won't have any need for these antiquated notions of, about high-level human emotions and responsibility and freedom and such. We'll just describe the way the system works, and that'll be the story. So I would say that I'm presenting an alternative view of neuroscience and mind and matter. And to return to my theme, I don't think this proves anything religiously, okay? So I'm not sitting here saying that any of this proves something religiously, but what I would say is that this view of complex systems, this view of distributed causality, of the causal importance of high levels of the system, this kind of view of the brain and explanation behavior is open to a holistic and profoundly religious view of the human person and our ultimate quest for meaning. I don't think it compels a religious interpretation, but it's open to the religious interpretation, and thus some of the perceived conflict actually melts away. So I'll just say thank you, and I appreciate your indulgence for staying with me a few extra moments here, and the work, I know the cognitive work you did to try to grab hold of that spatial memory thing. But I hope you got the general point, even if the details were a little lost. I'd be happy to answer questions. And AJ, turn the floor back to you.
Bill, thank you so much for this amazing lecture. There's some room and some time for questions, for Q&A. If you ask a question, try to be brief, concise, curious. And don't kind of lecture your own points for too long. That's like one of the things that scientists like to do for a long time. So try to be brief, concise, and curious. I think that's a good idea. Bill, actually, I want to ask you the first question since I have the mic here.
Yeah.
So
just be sure it's short,
exactly.
concise, and curious.
Exactly. So here we go. As an astrophysicist, the question, and interesting cosmology, the question that I get a lot is like, how do you see God involved in this universe? So the question of divine action.
Yeah.
As a neuroscientist, you say you're open to a holistic view right here of the human person. Yeah. Do you see as a neuroscientist a room for God interacting on a personal level with individuals?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I get. And AJ, I don't know if my answer will satisfy you or not, but I think a thoroughly religiously drenched and immersed view of God interacting with the world includes every minute of our lives, everything that happens. Okay, I think it's all pregnant with meaning and all pregnant with holiness if we, have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. So all of these normal mechanisms that we're talking about of perception through our senses, of memory, of ability for inference, for the sense of transcendence, I would argue. I am not bothered by the fact, I'm not bothered at all by the fact that there are likely biological mechanisms underlying those things. I think, just as I think that God can act through evolution and God can act through something like the Big Bang, I think that God can act through the normal biology of our brains. And I get people asking me sometimes, well, what about speaking in tongues? What's going on in the brains when people, exercise the charismatic gifts? And I say, well, that's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. If we put you inside an MR scanner and scan your brain, can you speak in tongues at will? Turn it on like that and turn it off? Or is it something that is just a gift of the Spirit that comes, and goes when it will? Because if you can turn it on and off, then we can scan your brain and we can tell you whether there's a different part of your brain that's activated or a different pattern of things. We could actually study it. But to study something in human cognitive neuroscience, it has to be a thing that we can kind of get under control and do predictably. And there are a lot of things about religious experience and the way people come to religious insight and come to religious conviction about faith that are not repeatable. They're not, there's no formula, there's no protocol that you can follow and lead to that thing so that we can really study it. Many times the best thing we can do is behavior. So I think that there is totally space. I mean, as a Christian, I think there's totally space for God here, but it's maybe I'm conceiving of it differently than many people.
Perfect. We can talk about it more later.
Yeah.
If you have a question, you can raise your hands. Also, if you're in the other room, we have a whole other room that is totally filled up. If you have a question, please come here to the door, and we can give you a mic as well. So. Andrew is going to run the mics around. If you have a question, just raise your hand.
Thank you so much for the excellent talk. I really appreciated the way you brought, free will as something at the very top of our hierarchical system of existence. How might how does religion play into, and at what point does it join our neuroscience in this hierarchy here?
Yeah.
What's controlling what, and what developed from the other?
Yeah, a great question and related to AJ's question, actually. At our faculty roundtable last evening, my colleague here at the University of Minnesota, David Reddish, presented a very different view of this, that free will is not something that sits at the top of some hierarchy of control, but that we have several parallel decision-making pathways or mechanisms in our brains, and that whole ensemble working together makes you, and you do have freedom to choose, and sometimes you depend more on one of these systems than the other, and a part of personal growth may be weighting these systems differently. So I go back to, my training as a neuroscientist, and I'm looking for changes in the brain. The central dogma here is that if you see a change in behavior, any change in behavior, there's going to be a change in the brain also, because all aspects of our mental lives are linked to the biology of the brain. So I think that I have a deep conviction, that there is a God, that there is a principle of loving intelligence and care at the center of our universe, at the center of our lives. Sometimes that conviction wanes a bit thin, being very honest with you, but it's not from science that it wanes thin. It's from reading the front page of the newspaper every day. That sometimes the flame flickers a little. So it's the problem of evil and suffering in the world that sometimes makes the flame flicker. But I think if I were an atheist, I would have equal problems with the concept of good. I think since I'm a theist, I have problems with the concept of evil. I think if I were an atheist, and I've tried to put myself in that position, I would have problems with the concept of good in anything more than a utilitarian kind of sense. And that's not to knock utilitarianism seriously, but it's just that for me personally, I have a conviction that there's something that transcends simple utilitarian calculations about morality and about the good life and what is really worth living for in some sense. So that's not a real precise answer to your question, but I hope it moves in the direction.
Could you talk about the ethical concerns regarding some of the lab work that's being done, the research that's being done, maybe manipulation of brain cells and genes and that kind of thing? What are the ethical concerns, and how do you feel about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that question. So this is about the ethics, and a lot of brain research has real ethical implications. Everything from the care of animals, animal subjects in experiments, they're a real ethical question. There's elaborate regulations on what we can and cannot do in laboratories. There are concerns about manipulation of people against their will. There are concerns about privacy of data. I mean, increasingly, the subject of my talk today was ways to record neural activity and actually read out decisions as they're being made in the brain. Actually know that just from looking at neural activity. And so there's questions about privacy of brain data that are ethical questions. Any treatments that come out of neuroscience discoveries, how those get distributed, they're ethical questions. But I do want to point out one thing, that brain manipulation has been with us for a long, long time. Okay, the whole goal of psychiatry is to, and psychiatrists contradict me if you want to about this, but I think a major goal of psychiatry is to change brains. Okay, it's to change the way people think and the way people feel. And some psychiatrists turn those knobs down at the pharmacological and synaptic level, and some psychiatrists turn those knobs up at a higher level with cognitive behavioral therapy. But in both cases, the goal is to manipulate the brain. Our last resort treatment for depression right now, I mean, the really severe, clinically life-threatening depression, our treatment of last resort is electroconvulsive therapy, right? It's electrical stimulation, general electrical stimulation of the brain. And that is a manipulation of the brain, and it keeps people alive. I have had two close friends who have had ECT. They both benefited from it. The problem with it is that it's a massive manipulation of the brain. It has big side effects, especially on short-term memory, the kind of interactive memory that we have. And something like optogenetics gives you the prospect of reaching in and touching circuits and manipulating circuits that are actually responsible for emotional tone, okay, and emotional reactions to the world. And I would love to have a day where instead of passing ECT through the head and jangling every synapse, it's like, for those of you who are PC people, by the PC, I mean PC computers, personal computers, not political correctness. This is like Control-Alt-Delete. It's like trying to reboot the brain. But what we really want to do are precise manipulations where there is dysfunction on emotional regulatory pathways. We'd like to be able to reach out and manipulate those circuits. So if we could get to a day where a person could come into the clinic and have their ultrasound treatment once every 3 months and live life free of the most debilitating aspects of depression, then that's brain manipulation, and I'm all for it. Okay, I'm for the therapeutic uses of these tools. Now, of course, as with any powerful technology, it can be used for bad, and it can be used recklessly. In addition to being used well, and we have to deal with those kinds of questions with all of our powerful technologies. So I don't think they're fundamentally new questions, but they're old questions that are applied in a very new setting they're going to have to be wrestled with. And when President Obama, I don't want to be political partisan here, this is a statement of fact, when he started the Brain Initiative, that I co-chaired the planning of, at the same time, he instructed the President's Council on Bioethics to take up ethical issues associated with the Brain Initiative. And they've published a couple of volumes of research on ethics, and there is a certain amount of Brain Initiative money that goes to fund research in neuroethics, which is a growing field. So thank you for the question, and that's a very real concern, and people are giving it a lot of thought and a lot of attention.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the talk. I had a question. So when you were kind of giving your description of self-determination and free will, you talked about how our memories and our beliefs can play a role, at least in part, on top of the genetic mechanisms. So my question is, how are those things such as beliefs and our experiences, how are those intrinsically different from genetic behavior? How are those? What are those comprised of, and how are they different from that?
Great question. Great question. So I would argue, and it'd be interesting to ask the cognitive neuroscientists in the room, I would argue that a belief is a higher level state of organization. It's a pattern of organized activity or organized synaptic strengths in the brain. So it's instantiated in the end in neurons and synapses, and the fact that you can change the weights of those synapses is how you store a new memory in the brain, okay? And I think that an aspiration or goals, they're a complex production of your past history, your growing convictions about value, the sense of the preciousness of your life, and wanting to use your time intentionally. And I think that those are higher level states of the brain. They're states that we don't understand yet. I'm trying to decipher simple decisions, like is the movement to the right or to the left, but you got to crawl before you can walk. So I interpret those as high-level states of the brain. Now, to push your question a little further, you could ask, well, in the end, aren't those higher-level states of the brain, aren't they simply ultimately cells and molecules and neurotransmitters, and in some sense, are they really any different? In character, in their essential character, are they different from, things that we more classically consider as genetically determined? And that's a serious question, and it's a serious discussion to have. And in the end, I think since I believe that a goal or a belief is a higher level organization of the brain, I think that, just like you can get that mouse to, change its behavior toward the opposite sex by stimulating there only a few thousand neurons, I think that you would have to have a much more complicated pattern of stimulation. I think that these higher level beliefs, values, aspirations, they are distributed more across the brain. It's not something as fundamental to reproduction as how you approach the opposite sex, so you can kind of understand how a tight little set of circuits deep in the amygdala and hypothalamus might control that, whereas a belief is probably more nebulous in the sense that it's more distributed. But in the end, it might be 100 million neurons, maybe. If you could go into my brain optogenetically and you could excite the neurons in the same pattern that normally occurs when I believe that the Earth is round, you could probably bring to my consciousness some contemplation on the fact that the Earth is round. Okay, so I am not saying that those beliefs are separate in some mental space from the biology. The biology is there. But if you want to get me out of this room, you could set up some optogenetic apparatus in my brain and stimulate 100 million neurons. That's 100 million knobs you have to turn, right? Maybe it's 10 million. Maybe it's only 5 million. I don't know, but it's a lot. Whereas you could just say, Bill, your wife called and there's an emergency at home and you need to take this phone call. That's one knob, right? As opposed to 10 million knobs. And so there's a certain amount of parsimony in taking the reality of these high-level beliefs. They're not just obstacles to be abolished by an imperialistic neuroscience, right? They are things to be complemented by neuroscience. Our understanding is deepened by the neuroscience, but in the end, they've remained They have causal power, they're parsimonious, they allow you to make predictions. I mean, if you want a prediction of where this collection of atoms called Bill Newsome is going to be at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, you don't want a Schrodinger wave equation, right, that predicts those atoms. What you want is this thing right here, right? You want access to that calendar on there. So, my point here is that reductionism as a method for doing science is fantastic. I've done reductionistic science most of the last 40 years, but to extend that philosophically to say, that the causal components are really the cells, really the synapses, really the neurotransmitters, and that, once we really understand all of those things, then we can sort of do away with the higher level stuff. I think that is just wrong, just flat out wrong. And I don't mean to say that you were implying that. You were asking a great question.
We've got another question that has come across the hallway from the overflow.
Hey, so just to better understand your top-down to bottom-up, I don't know if it's a theory or explanation, just to get a better understanding of it, is the top-down coming from a therapist point of view, dealing with the symptom of an emotion versus a belief and a core belief, versus the bottom-up where the Holy Spirit comes within us and changes us from the inside out?
Wow. Okay, that's a really interesting question that I haven't thought about. I would say that the understanding of top-down and bottom-up is not rooted in a therapist, and it's not rooted in an understanding, a religious understanding of the Holy Spirit. It's rooted in a good biological understanding of what mechanisms are and how causal explanation and causality is distributed throughout a mechanism. So that's where I think it comes from. I think that it's about where you can apply levers to change the system, and that to me is causality. And a therapist might use that. In terms of where the Holy Spirit, in a Christian context, or where other kinds of insight and religious insight in other religious traditions is concerned, I tend to think of that. Well, it's a combination. David Reddish, are you here tonight? There's David back there. I think David would, judging from his presentation last night, David would say that there is probably a deliberative component to that. So David distinguished between three sort of decision-making mechanisms in the brain, sort of a rational, deliberative, time-consuming process, and then sort of habits or instincts that we have learned that give us much quicker advantages in terms of survival, and then a level of simple reflexes that are really important, and that all three of these kinds of mechanisms, that's why I said I might have to change the title of the talk to, of three minds instead of two minds. But I think, David, you can speak for yourself if you want to, but I think that some deep sense of transcendence and religious conviction, I would attribute that more to, the deliberative thing. But you don't reach these things frequently through strictly rational deliberation. There is a real deep gut level element of motion and a movement of the emotions that accompany these deep convictions. I like to say that religious faith for me, religious belief, is about 1/3 cognitive assent to certain propositions, and it's about 1/3 intuition, and it's about 1/3 pure unadulterated hope. Okay. And to me, that's religious belief. But I don't know, David, have you thought at all about conversion experiences, whether they're religious or other kinds, political conversion experiences? Would you answer that question? Do you have more insight? David's right back here on the left. If a microphone can be run to him.
Normally I wouldn't do this. I'm being called out, so.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I should say I haven't really thought about it much, but I do think that there's some data on people who talk about that as coming from the instinctual kind of emotional component. And one of the things that I know there is data on is that a lot of our social interactions, a lot of, as I said last night, laughing with your friends, falling in love, and a lot of people who talk about religion talk about it as, love of God and things like that. that kind of love emotion is very definitely coming from the more instinctual and emotional sides rather than the deliberative rational. In fact, I think a lot of the deliberative stuff tends to push people away from these kinds of religious questions, which is part of why I was arguing that you need to think of the whole as the self, because if you're only going to call the deliberative yourself, then you lose a lot of that instinctual, emotional, falling in love. And I'm not prepared to talk about falling in love with God, but falling in love, well, poetry is falling in love with the world. Falling in love with the wonder and the transcendence of the world is very definitely an instinctual component with those brain structures we know to be involved in that system.
Yeah, you gave the example last night of falling in love with, you didn't use those words, you said faith in science, but it could be very similar kind of thing. David has a book coming out, by the way. Do I get a share of royalties if I add?
And I think we've got time for one more question here, and I saw one up here.
Thank you for the lecture. I'm curious if you view psychedelics and research on psychedelics as, there's, of course, it's rearranging neurons, but people often say they have a spiritual experience when they take those.
Yeah.
And so if you have any perspective on what you think the meaning of psychedelics are,
yeah,
I'd be curious to know that.
You guys are full of great questions tonight. This is amazing. For those of you who don't know, there's a serious resurgence of interest right now in the use of psychedelic drugs as adjuncts to therapy. And of course, they came under a black cloud 50 years ago when they were recreational drugs and had a lot of damaging effects on people. But there has always been an undercurrent throughout that time, an undercurrent of thought that the psychedelics, if properly used, properly dosed, and under the guidance of a therapist or a guide, as the new psychedelic community talks about it, there's always been a notion that these things could be used for real good. And there are actual clinical trials going on now for drugs like psilocybin, or MMDA, otherwise known as ecstasy, the happy drug, the party drug. But the notion that these things can be used, and they are used they have been used in terminal cancer patients dealing with pain and struggling with questions of meaning. They've been used in other contexts, and people, there's documentation in the literature. It's sparse at the moment, but growing. And there's some credible documentation that these can be life-changing experiences. Of course, something like peyote has been used for, in indigenous American religious rituals for years. So these are drugs that affect the brain. Their effects on brain circuit activity are very complicated. There are people studying them in the labs right at this moment, including a very active lab from one of my colleagues at Stanford. Leaping from the synaptic effects of these drugs up to the holistic experience of suddenly seeing your life in a different light and seeing your relationship to your life and having certain things that were burdens before lifted from you emotionally. People say, I don't do this kind of stuff, so you should do your own research on this. But and I'm not encouraging anyone to take. I think that might be illegal, but it's people say that these are a peak experience of their lives, and their effects last for years. That's a double-edged sword, right? It could be change it for the good, in other ways, and sometimes it might change you in ways that might make you really unrecognizable to your spouse or your family, right? So I think there's a big emphasis now, along with the resurgence of interest, a big emphasis on proper clinical and therapeutic context for using the drugs. But to me, as a neuroscientist, these things are fascinating. And as someone interested in cognition and the brain, these things are fascinating. When these things can be used to induce these kinds of experiences that are frequently expressed in the same language that religious experiences are expressed, they may be tapping into brain mechanisms that are really important for understanding how religious experience is linked to the biology of the brain. So I'm very fascinated by them. A lot of the people who are in this movement are pushing for licensing, pushing for FDA approval. I think there's been FDA approval, or soon will be, for some limited MMDA trials, if I'm remembering correctly. But I think this is definitely something to keep your eye on, and there are ethical dimensions to this as well. So I'm interested. I haven't taken any, but I'm interested.
David, thank you. No, not David, Bill.
Yes. It's okay.
Thank you.
I have a son named David.
Thank you so much for this amazing lecture and the fascinating discussion that we've had after that. Yeah, so if you can join me in thanking Bill for this evening.
Thank you.
We could go on for hours and hours and hours and hours more, probably. There's so many questions. We are transitioning from this room to Melrose Station, right over there. Bill will be there as well. Will be available for questions. He told me he's a night owl, so he will be on still. So if you have still interest in interacting with Bill, please go across the McNamara lawn, and there will be people there who guide you exactly to where you need to be. There's going to be food, there's going to be drinks, there's going to be live music. You can see our space is kind of a sneak preview because it's still a little bit under construction, but it's amazing. So we invite you to come there. Even if you just want to come in for like 5 minutes, you're totally welcome to be there. And that's why we'll gather now after this lecture. Thank you so much for being here. If you're interested in more Anselm House news, please sign up for a newsletter, and we'll send you emails on a regular basis. We do these lectures, symposia, and other events on a very regular basis, and we want you to be involved in those kind of things as well. So please sign up for those, and please be involved, and please come over to our new place there. Thank you so much for being here tonight, and hope to see you there.